Hi everyone, Pastor Donna here, and I want to thank you for joining us today for Sunday service. Today we're going to start a new series, or I'm going to be doing a new series on Saturdays, dealing with the book of Esther. There's a lot of interesting information in the book of Esther, so please stay tuned and join me as we go through this story of Esther and what it means for us today. Thank you for staying with me today and joining me as we discuss the book of Esther. Esther is a very interesting book to read. It's a really interesting story. The way it's set up, it's like each chapter is almost like a scene in a movie that we're watching. And it's just a really interesting book and an interesting story. But it's more than interesting. It's also something that we can look at and apply in our lives today. There's a couple side notes that I'd like to make before we get started. One is God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther. However, the book of Esther, is inspired by God. It is part of the Bible. And while we may not ever see God's name in this book, we do see his presence, and we see how he works to deliver his people and save his people. And that's really part of what the book of Esther is about. God using things that are happening to deliver his people at this time. That would have been the Jews. Okay. The second thing I would like to mention is that the Jews were commanded 400 years earlier to return to Jerusalem. So any Jews that were left here in this Persian Empire that were living there were actually disobedient to the command to return to Jerusalem. And despite that, God still used them to accomplish his purpose. Why? Well, I think you and I would agree that none of us are perfect in our worship of God. We all make mistakes. We all make decisions that may not quite always go hand in hand with what God wants. But because he's a God of patience and he's a God of love, he'll still use us, and he'll still work to make sure that we're delivered, that we're safe. And I think that is one of the most touching things about the book of Esther, is knowing that even though they were disobedient and did not return to Jerusalem, that God still worked for them, and God still maneuvered things to make sure that their lives were saved. So keep those things in mind as we go through the book of Esther. So we're going to go to the book of Esther. I'm going to go ahead and read some of the verses and make some of my comments as we're reading. So if you could just follow along with me, that would be great. So in chapter 1, verse 1, it sets the setting. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. 180 days, that's almost half a year. That's a few days short of half a year that this celebration was going on. And note the purpose of the celebration there in verse 4 was because he wanted to display his vast wealth and the splendor and glory of his majesty. So in verse 5, when these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement, and I have no idea what that word is. I'm going to need to look it up. Pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So here's a 7-day long banquet, okay, that ended a half a year celebration. And wine was served freely there. There were a lot of, here in the garden, there was so much expensive things. And he was showing off his treasures, of course. He wanted the people to see his vast wealth. And then wine was served, and they were served in goblets of gold. And the king's command was to give everyone, let every guest be allowed to drink as much or as little as they wanted. So now we go to verse 9. His then wife, Queen Vashti, also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Commentaries suggest that she giving the banquet for the women, that these were probably wives of the kings and all the leaders that King Xerxes had invited to his palace, maybe the concubines as well. But she gave this banquet for the women. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was high in spirits from the wine, in other words, super drunk, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zipthar, and Carcass, and I am not sure I pronounced those right, but they were his 7 eunuchs. And he commanded them to bring before him King Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So basically, he wanted to put his wife, Queen Vashti, on display. He wanted everyone to see how beautiful she was. And basically what he was doing was he was turning her into a possession, okay? Most commenters agree that she was being commanded to come to them wearing only her crown, or being asked to do some lewd act publicly, or she possibly had just given birth, because in the 3rd year of his reign, his son, King Artaxerxes, was born, who, by the way, was the one who saved Nehemiah. Okay, so if you know anything about the story of Nehemiah, that was King Artaxerxes, which was King Xerxes' son. So it is possible that she may have just given birth to Artaxerxes. So she, he really was doing something really uncalled for, that, any man who really loved his wife would not try to put her on display like that. So, when these eunuchs returned, in verse 12, it says, when the attendants delivered the king's command, King Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. And since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. I'm not even going to try to pronounce these names, But there's seven nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were the highest in the kingdom. And he basically asked them in verse 15, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs had taken to her. So what was their suggestion? Well, obviously he was angry. He felt humiliated because she wouldn't come out. So he seeks their help. What kind of advice do they give him? Okay, verse 16. Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, King Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought out before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all of the king's nobles in the same way, and there will be no end of the disrespect and the discord. So this particular wise man was what he was called then. He suggests that the king has to do something, because if he doesn't, then all the women in his empire will follow Queen Vashti's example and not come at the bequest of their husbands, and there would be no end to the disrespect and discord among the wives of the men there in their empire. So he continues in verse 19, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repelled, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. So his suggestion is to never allow Queen Vashti into his presence again, and to replace her with another woman who would be better. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler in his own house. Okay, so this was kind of a drastic thing that was taking place here, and supposedly it was in the interest of his kingdom and all the men in the kingdom, so so that they would follow the king's example, and that their wives would not follow the example of Queen Vashti and disrespect their husbands. So the advice was given to remove her, and King Xerxes approved of this advice, and so did what was suggested. So hence she was exiled and removed as queen. Now, what we would call this is a providential divorce. So similar to a divorce in our day, basically King Xerxes divorced her and exiled her. And we don't know if she was exiled either in the palace or somewhere else. But that basically was the end of their marriage, and she was no longer queen. I think one of the things that's important to realize now that we're done reading chapter 1 is we don't always understand why things happen in our lives. Like, we may not understand this. Why did he have to remove her as queen? Why did he divorce her and exile her? Because she wouldn't appear before him. And, we might have a lot of whys in this case. However, as we go through Esther, we're going to find that even though King Xerxes was really stuck on himself, he was stuck on his wealth, he was, stuck on his power, he had all these qualities that are against what God wants a person to be, God still used the circumstance for the benefit of his people. So we're going to end our story today with the fact that Queen Vashti is no longer queen, which then means that King Xerxes does not have a queen, so there is no queen in the empire. The three things that I would like to mention here that are shown, that are taking place, that are shown to be against God is, one, the lust of the flesh. Obviously, King Xerxes was a glutton. He was a glutton for food. He was a glutton with alcohol, and he fed into his fleshly desires. And also there was the lust of the eyes. So when they became, merry with wine, or they were intoxicated, he wanted to display his wife before them and was thinking of no one but himself and how good it would make him look. And the other one was the pride of life. It seems like everything that's happened in this chapter had to do with his pride. It embarrassed him or humiliated him that his wife would not come before them at his command, and that hurt his pride. So the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride. Those are three things that can get in the way of our relationship with God. But it also, as we see in this case, caused so many problems. We as Christians, we need to remember that this life, it's not about us. It's about denying ourselves and living for Christ and serving those around us. Letting Christ take care of the rest of our needs as we're seeking him. And so this is something that we should focus on. We want to do exactly the opposite of King Xerxes and, just live our life for God, knowing that this life is not about us and, how much power we can get or how many treasures we can get. This life is about God. So next week, we're going to go into chapter 2 and we're going to find out what happens. About 3 years will have gone by, and we're going to find out what happens when the king starts to regret that he no longer has a queen. So I hope that you'll join me for that particular chapter, and have a good weekend, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.